There are moments, my dear family, when the wind carries a whisper long before the world recognizes the shift. Moments when an entire people, bruised by storms and burdened by silence, begin to speak softly, yet with a power that shakes distant shores. And today, across the Caribbean, from the dimly lit shelters of Jamaica to the flooded lanes of Dominica, there is a murmur rising. A murmur that does not carry the name of Washington, nor the promises of America. Instead, it carries something new, something unexpected, something many elders are calling an Ibrahim Traore moment. For over 60 years, the Caribbean looked north each time disaster struck, hoping, praying, believing that aid, dignity, and respect would arrive swiftly. But this season, as storms tore through homes and governments stood hesitant, the people did not look to the White House. They looked elsewhere. And that shift, that quiet turning of the heart, is where our story begins. Before we walk deeper into this message, make sure you subscribe, family, so you never miss a voice of truth, dignity, and awakening. Because what the Caribbean is whispering now may soon become a declaration the whole world hears. Storms do not simply bring rain, they bring revelation. And when Hurricane Melissa tore across the Caribbean, peeling roofs from houses in Jamaica, sweeping away roads in Dominica, and drowning entire fields in St. Lucia, it revealed a truth many had refused to say aloud for decades. The Caribbean has been standing in the doorway of a house that no longer welcomes it. In Kingston, elderly men sat outside shuttered shops, listening to battery-powered radios that crackled with broken reports of power outages, empty fuel stations, and delayed governmental briefings. In Roseau, mothers stood in long queues, holding children who had not slept in 2 nights, waiting for generators that never arrived. In St. Vincent, whole districts were left in darkness as the sea swallowed their lines. The Caribbean was bruised, shaken, soaked to the bone, yet waiting. Waiting for the familiar sound of American planes, the reassuring hum of assistance, the gesture that once came as swiftly as the storm itself. But this time, America did not move with urgency. The White House was quiet. Washington officials issued statements of sympathy, but sympathy cannot turn the lights back on. Sympathy cannot cool a hospital when its generators fail. Sympathy cannot keep medication from spoiling or food from rotting. The Caribbean did not need sympathy. It needed presence. And so, in the vacuum of silence, people began to ask questions they had never dared to voice. Are we still valued? Are we still seen? Are we still allies? Or are we simply a footnote in someone else's priorities? These were not the words of radical youth. These were the murmurs of grandmothers in shelters, elders who had lived through the hurricane of 1980, the storm of 2004, the earthquake in Haiti, the floods in Trinidad. They had seen disaster, but they had also seen help. And now, for the first time, they saw hesitation. It was during this moment of fear and reflection that another voice emerged, not loud, not boastful, but steady. Ibrahim Traore, the young leader from Burkina Faso, spoke of unity, dignity, and the sacred duty of nations to uphold each other in times of suffering. His message traveled not through political speeches, but through small clips, shared on Caribbean phones, passed from neighbor to neighbor. Elders replayed his words as if searching for something they had forgotten long ago. Respect. People asked themselves, how is it that a leader from so far away speaks to us with more clarity than those who claim to be our oldest friends? It was not merely his tone, nor his youth, nor his revolutionary posture. It was the sincerity, the sense of shared history, and the unmistakable impression that he understood their pain. Social media across Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua lit up with commentary analyzing the Ibrahim Traore reaction to disasters across the African continent, how he sent aid, how he moved quickly, how he spoke with conviction rather than caution. Caribbean elders began saying, "This is the kind of leadership we once expected from across the ocean." The shift was small at first, a whisper in a shelter, a conversation in a church hall, a quiet debate in a community center. But whispers, when joined together, become wind. And the wind began to blow through Caribbean consciousness, stirring a memory that had been asleep. The memory that their ancestors were not born to depend on distant powers, but to stand tall with dignity. Washington may have thought the storm was just another storm, but for the Caribbean, it became a reckoning, a turning point, a moment when they realized that the world they once trusted might no longer be the world that will protect them. Elders repeated the same sentence again and again. Something is changing. Not in anger, but in awakening. The hurricane tore apart homes, yet it also tore apart illusions. It forced a conversation long avoided. If America hesitates in our darkest hour, then whom should we trust in the light? And it is here, family, where the first chapter of our story rises to its peak. Not in destruction, but in discovery. For when a people find their voice in the middle of devastation, that voice becomes impossible to silence. But what came next, what the Caribbean did with this awakening, would shake more than islands. It would shake the very assumptions of global power. When the wind settled and the waters withdrew, the Caribbean did something unexpected. Instead of bowing their heads and waiting for the great northern neighbor to step forward, they lifted their faces and looked inward and outward and towards each other. In Jamaica, community elders gathered on church verandas, their clothes still damp from the storm, speaking in low tones about what they had witnessed. In Dominica, families sat around small tables lit by candles, replaying short clips on their phones, clips of speeches from leaders who had no historical obligation to the Caribbean, yet spoke as if they shared its wounds. The conversations traveled faster than the relief trucks. "Did you hear how he spoke?" one woman asked her neighbor. "He did not speak about us as victims. He spoke about us as people." In St. Lucia, a retired teacher described the experience as an Ibrahim Traore moment, not because of politics, but because she felt something she had not felt in years: dignity. She said, "It is not about choosing a new master. It is about remembering we are not servants." The Caribbean is a place where memory moves like tidewater. It flows back and forth, carrying stories from century to century, trauma to trauma, triumph to triumph. And so, as these conversations spread, people began to remember. They remembered how their ancestors once stood resilient without waiting for approval from distant capitals. They remembered leaders who spoke with truth rather than hesitation. They remembered unity that stretched across islands, across cultures, across oceans. In Barbados, an elderly fisherman named Samuel stood before a crowd on the pier, his voice trembling not with age but conviction. "Hear me," he said. "For 70 years we have trusted the same hands to catch us when we fall. But this time, those hands were slow. So why do we cling to them as if we cannot stand on our own feet? The world is changing, and we must change with it." This was not rebellion. It was revelation. Clips of African leaders visiting disaster zones circulated across social media. People compared their behavior with the muted statements from Washington. They saw how African nations, though poorer in economic wealth, were richer in solidarity and immediacy. They saw how leaders like Ibrahim Traore traveled with humility, walked among the suffering, and spoke not to cameras but to people. They saw how Africa, once painted as dependent, was beginning to reclaim its posture. The Caribbean elders felt the shift in their bones. For many of them, America had been a symbol of reliability, opportunity, and refuge. They had children who lived there, grandchildren who studied there, and memories of decades when the United States stood firm during storms. But this time felt different. Not because America did not care, but because America did not seem present. And presence matters. Presence is what holds a frightened child during a blackout. Presence is what saves a hospital when the last generator coughs. Presence is what transforms despair into courage. The Caribbean waited for presence, not promise. Across Trinidad and Antigua, radio hosts began inviting church leaders, sociologists, historians, and community elders to discuss the deeper meaning of this moment. People spoke cautiously at first. "We are not abandoning America," one pastor said, "but we are recognizing that we have more options than we once believed." Another caller said, "We want partnership, not dependency, respect, not pity." The reactions were not uniform. Some feared the geopolitical consequences. Others worried about economic ties. But beneath all the debate lay a quiet truth. The Caribbean had been emotionally shaken. And when a people are shaken, they see more clearly. A shift in perception began to settle like dust after a storm. The region saw Africa not as a distant continent, but as a mirror, a reminder of shared ancestry, shared struggle, and the possibility of shared strength. Young people posted messages calling for deeper Caribbean-African cooperation. Elders wrote open letters urging leaders to diversify alliances. Community groups organized discussions on self-reliance, regional resilience, and the meaning of dignity. It was no longer about a single leader or a single speech. It was about awakening. It was about a region rediscovering its worth and questioning why it ever doubted it. And as these reactions grew louder, the world began to listen. Governments took note. Analysts raised eyebrows. Commentators whispered that the Caribbean was entering a new season, a season in which it no longer looks solely north, but also east and across the Atlantic, towards lands connected by blood and history. Yet, family, the most powerful reaction, was not political at all. It was spiritual, a collective sense that a door had opened, that the Caribbean, long overshadowed, could finally step into its rightful light. But what the Caribbean did next, what they decided to confront and challenge, would change the balance far beyond their islands. When the first shock faded, the Caribbean entered a period of deep, trembling reflection. In Jamaica, community leaders gathered beneath the broken rafters of a half-collapsed hall, taking attendance not to plan a festival, but to map a future that no longer looked the same. Their conversations carried the weight of generations. "If help does not come when we cry," an elder said, "then perhaps we must learn to cry less and build more." Across Antigua, shopkeepers swept mud from their storefronts while murmuring about the silence from Washington. For decades, they had kept American flags hanging beside their doors, not out of obligation, but out of habit, out of gratitude, out of memory. But now, as they cleaned the debris left by Melissa, they questioned what that symbol meant if it did not bring comfort in their time of greatest need. The consequences were not merely political. They were personal. In St. Vincent, a grandmother named Marjorie, known for her calm wisdom, gathered her grandchildren around a lantern and told them, "Children, Never depend on a single branch, for if that branch breaks, the fall will be great. She did not speak with bitterness. She spoke like someone who had learned the lesson through bruises of her own. Her words traveled from house to house like gospel. Regional newspapers published editorials demanding accountability. Community organizations organized forums on resilience. Radio hosts invited callers to share their fears and hopes. People spoke openly about how the Caribbean had been caught with too few allies, too few options, and too many assumptions. In Barbados, a former diplomat said, "We are not angry. We are awakened. There is a difference." He explained that storms do not only destroy buildings, they also strip illusions bare. The illusion that America will always be first. The illusion that we must always wait. The illusion that the Caribbean cannot stand tall. His speech spread rapidly, played again and again in churches and community halls. Meanwhile, Haiti, already wounded by decades of instability, looked upon the shifting mood of its neighbors with a mixture of pain and longing. Many Haitians whispered that perhaps this was the beginning of something larger than aid, perhaps it was the beginning of regional dignity. They saw the Caribbean questioning old alliances, and they felt a flicker of hope that unity might one day include them fully, not as an afterthought, but as a sibling. Governments across the region began talking about strengthening regional disaster response systems. They discussed building shared energy grids, joint agricultural reserves, and cooperative emergency units that could deploy within hours, not days. These were ideas that had existed for years, but had been shelved repeatedly, because the region assumed external rescue would always come. Now those ideas were dusted off and placed at the center of the table. But the most powerful consequence was spiritual. The Caribbean had been forced to rediscover its identity. Grandparents told stories of ancestors who survived enslavement, who carved lives out of hardship, who refused to surrender their dignity. Teachers reminded students that the Caribbean was not a passive space waiting to be saved, but a living civilization shaped by courage. In the churches, pastors preached sermons about self-reliance, unity, and the importance of rebuilding not only structures, but spirits. In the markets, vendors spoke about cooperation between islands. In schools, children drew pictures of the region standing together, islands connected by bridges of light. And then, slowly, softly, another conversation began. If not only America, then who stands with us? Some mentioned Europe, others mentioned China, but many elders pointed towards Africa, the land of their forefathers, not because of politics, but because of blood. "We came from those shores," one elder said in a community gathering. Perhaps it is time to look back and remember the strength that traveled with us across the ocean. African commentators noticed this shift and began speaking warmly about Caribbean resilience. Social media across the continent highlighted stories of unity and cultural connection. The idea of partnership, once distant and abstract, became tangible. It felt like a return, not of dependence, but of kinship. But unity, family, is not achieved without resistance. As the Caribbean explored new alliances, powerful nations began to watch carefully. Analysts warned that shifting loyalties could reshape the balance of influence in the region. Political figures expressed concern that the Caribbean might drift. Yet, the people were no longer afraid of such warnings. Because once a people awaken to their own worth, fear loses its hold. Still, as the region embraced this new consciousness, one question hung in the air like incense after prayer. If we step forward into this new season, who will stand with us, and who will stand against us? And that question, family, would soon echo far beyond the Caribbean, drawing eyes from every corner of the world. While the Caribbean examined its wounds and its worth, the world was watching with sharpened attention. In Washington, corridors that once echoed with quiet confidence began to hum with concern. Analysts in think tanks whispered that something subtle yet profound was happening. The Caribbean is shifting, one report said, not in anger but in orientation. Government officials studied satellite images of flooded islands, read transcripts of local radio conversations, and realized the truth they had long avoided. Influence is not maintained by history alone. Across the Atlantic, in London, observers felt a sting of déjà vu. The United Kingdom, once the colonial ruler of many Caribbean territories, recognized the tone of awakening that was rising across the islands. British commentators asked, "Has the region finally grown tired of waiting for promises that arrive too late?" Some even admitted, reluctantly, that the Caribbean's search for dignity was long overdue. Further east, in Beijing, policymakers did not react with surprise. China had already spent years building relationships in the global south, presenting itself as a partner eager to invest, construct, and support. Chinese analysts noted the shifting conversations with quiet satisfaction. Alignment changes slowly, one strategist said, but once it begins, it rarely reverses. In Brussels, the European Union expressed concern that instability or disillusionment in the Caribbean might create new geopolitical openings. They feared a vacuum, for vacuums invite competition, and competition invites consequences. Yet amid all these reactions, the sharpest shift came again from Washington. For decades, American officials had assumed that the Caribbean, bound by geography, culture, and history, would always remain under its sphere of influence. But now newspapers printed headlines asking whether America had taken the region for granted. Former diplomats admitted that trust, once strained, is not easily repaired. Commentators on national television warned that hesitation during disaster creates more damage than the disaster itself. Still, what troubled Washington most was not the potential loss of influence. It was the symbolism of the moment. The Caribbean, a region long portrayed as dependent, was openly exploring new alliances and identities. It was no longer waiting for someone else to define its place in the world. Yet, what the United States failed to recognize was this: the Caribbean's awakening was not about turning against America. It was about turning towards itself, towards agency, towards sovereignty, towards possibility. And in Africa, the reaction was one of warmth. African commentators celebrated the Caribbean's desire for dignity, saying, "We share your story, and we honor your strength." African scholars spoke of historical reconnection, cultural revival, and the power of unity across oceans. It was as if two continents, long separated by tragedy, were finally speaking to each other again. But as these conversations spread, as global powers recalibrated their strategies, as alliances trembled and old assumptions cracked, one question loomed larger than all others. If the Caribbean is rising, who will rise alongside it? And who will try to pull it back down? The world had given its reactions. Governments had issued their statements. Analysts had drawn their charts. But now, the final and most difficult question lay before the Caribbean. What comes next? Because storms may end, but seasons continue. And the islands were entering a new season, one they could not navigate with old assumptions. In Jamaica, community elders gathered beneath a tarpaulin stretched over a cracked foundation. Rainwater dripped near their feet as they spoke about the path ahead. "We cannot return to yesterday," one elder said. "Yesterday did not come for us when we needed it." His words were not bitter, they were clear. He understood that a future built on hope must also be built on honesty. Across St. Lucia, farmers who had lost their crops sat beneath leaning trees, sketching ideas for regional food systems, seed-sharing networks, and storm-resistant farming methods. They spoke softly but confidently, believing that the Caribbean could feed itself if it embraced cooperation rather than competition. "The hurricane destroyed our fields," one farmer said, "but it did not destroy our will." In Barbados, university students organized forums discussing the future of energy independence. They spoke of solar grids stretching across rooftops, wind projects spanning coastal cliffs, and community batteries strong enough to survive even the fiercest storms. Their vision was not fantasy, it was necessity. They believed the Caribbean must become a region capable of keeping its own lights on, even when the world looks away. Meanwhile, in Trinidad, religious leaders held vigils that doubled as strategic conversations. They prayed for strength, but they also prayed for wisdom, the wisdom to choose allies carefully, the wisdom to build domestic resilience, and the wisdom to avoid falling into the traps of new dependence while trying to escape the old. "Freedom," one pastor said, "is not gained by finding a new master. Freedom is gained by finding your voice." Across the region, this understanding took root. The Caribbean's future must be built not on loyalty to distant powers, but on loyalty to itself. That did not mean isolation. It meant discernment. It meant partnership based on dignity, not desperation. And soon, discussions turned towards Africa, not as a replacement for America, but as a reflection. The Caribbean saw in Africa a journey that mirrored its own, a struggle for self-definition, a battle against external control, and a rising generation determined to walk with its head high. Perhaps, a Trinidadian scholar said, "The future is not north or south, but across the ocean where our story began. Across these islands, from village squares to university halls, a single truth echoed. Storms are inevitable, but dependency is optional." Still, as the Caribbean prepared to step forward into this new season of courage, unity, and discernment, another question, deeper, heavier, more spiritual, began to rise from the collective soul of the region. If the Caribbean chooses a new path, who will bless it? Who will challenge it? And who will fear what it becomes? So here we stand, family, at the edge of a new horizon. The Caribbean, long shaped by storms and silence, has stepped into a moment of reflection that feels heavier than wind and deeper than water. A region once taught to wait has begun to walk. And as Jamaica rebuilds its broken homes, as Haiti lifts its weary eyes, and as the islands whisper courage into the night, a truth rises like dawn. Identity cannot be borrowed, and dignity cannot be delayed. This season has revealed something extraordinary. Not anger, but awakening. Not rebellion, but remembrance. The people of the Caribbean have reached a point that many elders are describing as an Ibrahim Traore moment. A stirring of spirit that reminds them they are not defined by hesitation from distant capitals, but by the resilience living in their bones. It is a moment that stretches beyond politics, reaching into history, ancestry, and faith itself. From Africa came warmth, affirmation, and echoes of solidarity. And from America came questions about loyalty, influence, and responsibility. Yet the most important Ibrahim Traore moment was not created by foreign powers at all. It was created by the islands themselves, by the courage of communities that refused to surrender their dignity even when the lights went out. What moved the Caribbean most was not a single speech nor a single leader, but the sincerity they witnessed in an Ibrahim Traore reaction, the kind of response that spoke to their worth rather than their weakness. It reminded the region that partnership must feel like respect, not relief. And so, family, the future lies not in choosing one master over another, but in choosing themselves, choosing unity, choosing discernment, choosing to stand tall whether or not the world applauds. Now the question rests with you. Do you believe the Caribbean is entering a new chapter, one written not by dependence but by destiny? Share your wisdom, your hope, your truth. Before you leave, subscribe, family, so this message of dignity, awakening, and courage can continue to reach every soul who needs it. A storm may shake a people, but it can also shape them. And the Caribbean, rising from water and wind, is shaping itself anew. Let the world watch. Let the world listen. Let the world learn